Ruth, do you want to start?
Yes, I will. I was just going to give it a couple of minutes, Vic, just to see if any more participants would like to join.
Yeah.
I'll just give it a minute or two, and then we will start for sure. Welcome to those who've already joined, though. It's always unnerving not being able to see you, but nice that you're here. I think we can make a start, and then other people can join as we go along. And anyway, this will be recorded so that people can access it at a later date. So welcome everyone to our webinar tonight on what to do about stored embryos. I'm Ruth Wild, Senior Facility Counsellor working with Complete Fertility. You'll see my two colleagues there. I was going to say the one with glasses, both got glasses on. Okay, the one with the hair in the ponytail, that's probably the easiest way, is Vic Ryder, who's the laboratory manager, and Julie Hedges, the one without the hair in the ponytail, is the donor coordinator who manages the whole donor programme for Complete Fertility. Move on, Vic, please. So what we're going to be looking at tonight are what kind of challenges there are for you in terms of making decisions about your embryos. We do know that across the country there are thousands of embryos in storage. Some are waiting to be used, but some are spare, or some are where couples are no longer intending to have a child together. And it is a very difficult decision to decide what to do about stored embryos that you think that you will no longer be using in treatment for yourself. And we want to guide you through your options tonight. Looking at, particularly Julie and Vic will be looking at your options about training and research. I'll go on to that in a little bit, and looking at the implications of donating embryos, if that's something that you would want to consider. We know and acknowledge that any embryos that are in storage will have taken, well, you don't need me to tell you, blood, sweat and tears to create. And I know that they're very precious. They're very, very precious to the people who have created them. And we want to honour that, which is why we really wanted to give you some good information about the kind of things that you could choose to do with your embryos, and to give you an opportunity to have your questions answered either at the end or as we go along. What I would ask you to do, if that's okay, is you'll see at the bottom of the screen there is a Q&A box. Please could you type your questions in as you think about them, and as we go through or at the end we will try and address all the questions asked. And if we can't, then there will be somebody at the clinic who will be able to, or we'll be able to direct you into the right place. So that's the plan for tonight. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom. Next slide, please. I've learned that from Chris Whitty. Did you like that? Next slide, please. I've got ideas above my station. So we're going to be looking at what your options are tonight. In brief, these are the sort of the 5 areas that we're going to explore. So embryos can be used in research, they can be used for training, they could be discarded in a humane way, and we will talk about that, because even the concept of discarding hard-won embryos is a very hard one. You could continue to store them, or you could donate them for the treatment of others. And I'd like to pass you on to Vic now, who's going to say a little bit about embryo storage itself and the opportunities for the first 4 really, before we move to Julie, who will talk to you about the ins and outs of embryo donation, and then I will say a little bit about what the implications might be of doing that. So over to you, Vic.
Thank you, Ruth. So I'm Victoria, I'm the lab manager here at Complete, and as Ruth said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit firstly about how embryos are stored, because I think it's a difficult concept to get your head around what your embryo might look like whilst it's in storage and what that means. So that's I'll set a bit of context for you first of all before I run through the options, some of the options in a bit more detail. So most of you, if you've had your embryos frozen and stored at complete, you have probably got embryos that look a little bit like this, are blastocysts. This is a really nice looking, well-developed day 5 embryo. And they are stored in a little microscopic drop of fluid on the end of these plastic straws. So if you can see, there's a coloured straw, and at the end there's a black tip and a clear plastic strip. So the embryo is just popped onto that straw in a tiny, tiny, tiny drop of fluid that you wouldn't be able to see it with the naked eye, and dipped into liquid nitrogen. And then there's a little sheath that goes on those straws, and they're stored on racks in the tanks that we have. So that's what you can see on the right is a nitrogen tank with lots of canes in it. It's how your embryos might look while they're in our storage tanks. They're labelled, so we have a little label that goes on the handle of the straw, so that's this kind of square bit at the end. It's labelled with your name, your date of birth, your hospital number, the date they were frozen, and also an individual barcode which links up with our electronic witnessing process. And they're stored at minus 196 degrees, so very, very cold. That just gives you an idea of the kinds of things that I'll be talking about when I'm talking about removing embryos from storage and that kind of thing. So we looked at your options very briefly before. The first one that I'm going to talk about is research. Okay, I've put in each of these options a few pros and cons. I'm absolutely not suggesting that these are all the pros, all the cons. I've just tried to put myself in your position and think, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these options? It's not an exhaustive list, and some of them may not be as important to you as they might be to other people and things like that. So one of the first things that you can do if you've completed your family and you decided that you don't want to pursue any more treatment is to register to donate your embryos to research. Okay, and that's something that lots of people are really interested in because they want to feel like, as Ruth said, so much hard work and investment has gone into creating these embryos and bringing them into being, that a lot of people feel like they want them to be put to good use. They don't want them to be wasted. They may not want to use them themselves, but they want to know that those embryos have contributed to something bigger in many ways. So donating embryos to research can be a good way of feeling like that about your embryos. What would happen, the practicalities of that is that when you complete your consent form, you say, yes, I'd like to donate the embryos to research, but it's very much dependent on a research project being available. And what happens is we would continue to store embryos until such a time that a research project became available, or if nothing becomes available, until your storage consent expires. So for most people, that's 10 years from when the embryos were frozen. As with anything with embryos, they are effectively owned in a way by both of the gamete providers. So the sperm provider and the egg provider both have legal ownership of the embryos until the point that they are used. So when we're talking about research or any of these different options, they're all very reliant on both the egg provider and the sperm provider giving their consent, which may be you and your partner, or it may be an egg donor or a sperm donor. Okay, so some of the pros, as I said, about donating to research is that you're putting the embryos to good use. They're stored with us, can continue to be stored with us potentially for several years, but you wouldn't pay storage fees. And one of the concerns that many people have about research is how would those embryos be used? Are they going to be used to create babies for other people, or are they going to be used in a way in which I don't consent? Not the case at all. You would be required to give specific consent about a research project, so you have the final say on that. And also, embryo research is regulated in exactly the same way that fertility treatment is regulated by the HFEA. And we're really lucky in this country that we have that kind of regulatory structure. So there are certain securities that come with that in terms of thinking about how your embryos would be used in research. Cons is that potentially we may contact you in the future if a research project becomes available to give consent. So it's not a way of ending contact with the clinic, this option. It's not possible to donate your embryos to research if one or other of the gamete providers, the sperm or the egg provider, doesn't give consent to it. And one of the things at the moment, which is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, is that we don't actually have any active research projects happening now in Southampton. So we have quite a few embryos that we've got in storage that we really want to be used in research, and patients have given their consent, but no facility in Southampton to use those. But what we're thinking about doing is, first of all, establishing a research project in Southampton. Secondly, linking up with other research projects that are happening around the country and transferring embryos with patients' consent to those research projects. Or there's always the option, if you want to have a look into what kind of research is available, to decide to donate your embryos to a particular project if that's something you want to do. There may be transport costs involved in that, but that's definitely an option that is open. So if you want to find out a little bit more about what research is available, there is a page on the HFEA website, which I've put the link to there, the address to, that tells you a little bit about the licensed projects that are available all over the country. So these are just the headlines from a few different centres, just to give you an idea of the variety. And as you'll see, many of them are about improving fertility treatment. So potentially by donating your embryos to research, you could be helping other patients that are in a similar situation to you in the future to have a better experience or to have a better chance of success. And I think that's one of the big appeals of donating to research. This one at the bottom, filming of human implantation in vitro, that's a really interesting one that I've seen presented at conferences actually, which is incredible. To see the work that lab is doing, but there are a few bits and pieces there, and that website is actually a really interesting read. I would recommend having a look at that. The second option that I'll talk about is donating your embryos to training. So that is a similar kind of thing to research, in that we would continue to store the embryos until we can use them in training. And again, it's highly regulated. We are only allowed to use them under certain circumstances and for certain purposes. And this would be literally just to allow our trainee or training laboratory staff to practice the procedures that we use all the time in IVF. So it would probably be thawing the embryos out and maybe moving them around culture dishes and that kind of thing, which is all really essential work that we have to do when we're training, and something that is also really, really highly valued by the team as well when people donate to training. Because I think a lot of people would think about it as a kind of a safer option than donating to research, because I don't know, I think it's kind of on a smaller scale, I think. So you can do something that's really beneficial, but you don't, if you don't have to worry about creation of stem cells or something like that if you're not comfortable with that kind of thing. And you can always apply to the clinic to find out how your embryos have been used. Okay, so we would potentially continue to store them, but again, there would be no storage fees involved in that, and there is no further contact required if that's not something that you want. Okay, so you've got the option of finding out how the embryos were used if you wanted to. Same point on consent. We need consent from both the sperm and the egg provider for this. It's something that you give consent to or not on your regular IVF consent forms as well. So it may be something that you've already kind of expressed an interest in through that means. And the embryos might not be used immediately. Humane discard. This is where when you decide that you don't want to continue to store the embryos, you don't want to donate them to research or training or any other options, we remove them from storage. When the embryos are frozen, we actually we rehydrate the cells before they're frozen using chemicals that help protect the cells from the very, very cold temperatures. And when we thaw them for use in treatment, we quickly extract that fluid from the embryo and replace it with water. When we are removing embryos from storage, because we're not going through that thawing process, those chemicals that are inside the cells already that help to protect it when it's at very cold temperatures are also what causes the cells to degenerate or not to survive very long when they're just at room temperature. So humane discard is really removing the embryos from storage, leaving them for a few minutes at room temperature, and then the cells in the embryo will just naturally start to degenerate. The embryos are cells at this point, so they don't have a nervous system. You know, they don't feel pain, there's no suffering or anything like that when in an embryo at this stage. So there's no concerns about that. And something that is an option to you as well, that quite a few patients have done in the past, is that if you want to, you can come and collect the straws from us and take them home if you want to. And I think a lot of people find that really helpful and brings them a bit of closure as well. So that's very much something that we could offer. If that's not something that you want to do, what we normally do with the straws is that they're disposed of as part of the hospital clinical waste. So the advantages, some of them you might think of advantages of discarding your embryos, removing them from storage, is that this is probably a good option to give you complete closure, because there is no prolonged contact with the clinic, there's no you know, it's very final, and some people may see that as something that they really value. And of course, if there's nothing in storage, then there's no storage fees as well. Obviously, there's a huge amount of emotion around this option, and it's a really difficult decision to come to. And so for some people, you know, there are those associations with it, but also the feeling that some people feel like their embryo's not been put to good use, or that it might have been wasted in some way if it could have brought value in another way. Another option, I think the final option I'm going to talk to you about, is to continue storage. Okay, so this is very much kind of leaving your options open. If you're still, you know, if you're still a little bit undecided, then this is probably the best option for you. Keep your options open, delay some decision making, but you do need to be aware that obviously if we've still got embryos in storage, you have to continue to pay storage fees, but more importantly, there is always a time limit on how long you can keep embryos in storage. And for most people, that is 10 years. Okay, so the law says that you can keep embryos or sperm or eggs in storage for 10 years under any circumstances, but you can only extend beyond 10 years if you are prematurely infertile or at risk of becoming. And so that's mainly cancer patients. So if you're thinking about continuing storage, you do just need to be aware that there is probably a finite timeline on that, and at 10 years, the only remaining option will be to remove the embryos from storage, because you can't consent, most people can't consent to extend storage after that. That's probably it from me. I just want to say as well that for all of these options, you at any time have the option to withdraw or to change your consent. So if you decide to change your mind, you can do so up until the point that embryos have been used. So used in research or training or removed from storage. So that is something that you should bear in mind as well. So that's research training, humane discard, and to continue storage. I will hand over to Julie now, if that's okay with you guys, to talk a little bit about the final option, which is to donate your embryos for the treatment of others.
Thank you, Vic. Hi, my name's Julie. I'm the donor coordinator here at the Complete Fertility Centre. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the option of donating your embryos. There will be couples or single ladies that, for whatever reason, need donor embryos to be able to carry a child. So it's a really lovely thing to consider doing, but it's not for everyone. And Ruth will talk a little bit at the end about the implications of donating your embryos. It is an option there for you if you have embryos in storage and you've completed your family. It might be something that you want to do to help somebody else start a family. But you have to meet certain criteria. So at the time the embryos were created, the male and the female have to meet the same criteria as an egg and sperm donor. So you would have to have been aged between 18 and 35 if you're a female, and 18 and 45 for a male. You would need to have at least 2 good quality blastocysts in storage to be able to donate. And we would prefer that you had completed your own family before you just chose to donate to somebody else. We have to have, there's some health implications, so we would be looking for no family history of anything hereditary or genetic, and no sort of serious mental or physical illnesses yourself. And donors can help create a maximum of 10 families. It would be really unusual for somebody who's donating their embryos to do that anyway, but it is something the law does say. There's a criteria that you do have to meet. Can I have the next slide, please?
Great. Just answering a question.
Oh, sorry. So if you meet the criteria, and as I've said, various things you would need to meet, the next step is we would ask you to complete an eligibility questionnaire. You would return that to us, and it will ask you about your medical history, your family's medical history. So, and if there are any queries on that, we would come back to you and have a chat about that. If your questionnaires come back and we're quite happy with the answers, obviously we'd be in contact with you, and we will then ask you to have some implication counselling. So anybody that's donating, be that embryos, sperm or eggs, we do ask them to have at least 1 implication counselling session, just to make sure they understand all the implications of donating. Following that, we would also contact your GP just to ask for a brief medical history, which is the same we would do for anybody who's donating. We would bring you in to have infection and genetic screening. So this is done retrospectively. So egg and sperm donors would do that prior to donating. But obviously with donating embryos, we don't know when you create the embryos that you're going to donate them. So we do that retrospectively. So the infection screening would be for things like HIV, hepatitis, syphilis, chlamydia, gonorrhea. There's a list of lovely things we have to screen you for. And some genetic screening, one of which is a karyotype, which looks at your chromosomes. And we would screen you to make sure you're not a carrier of cystic fibrosis. There can be extra genetic screening depending on ethnic background, but we would discuss that with you if that was needed. A doctor will review all of the results and the information from the GP, a questionnaire, to make sure they're happy for the donation to go ahead. And there would be some consents for you to fill out to say, just to confirm that you are happy to donate your embryos. I would usually fill those out with you. Next slide, please, Vic. So there's a form we ask you to complete, which is one of the HEFA forms, so the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority. We have to let them know about anybody that's donating, so we register all donors with the HEFA. And one of the forms you fill out is called a donor information form, and part of that asks you to write a personal description, your reasons for donating. You might want to write a little bit about why you're donating, and also a goodwill message to any child born as a result of your donation. So we would ask you to complete that form, and we would also use that form to register you with the HEFA. It's important to know that at the age of 18, a donor conceived person can make an application to find out the identity of the donor. What's important for anybody donating to know is they have no legal, financial or parental responsibility, but it is important to understand from the start that that is a possibility. You could be contacted when a donor conceived child reaches the age of 18. That's one of the reasons we register you with the HEFA, because they will carry that information, and they will be the people that an application would be put into. So how we match donor embryos with a recipient. So it can be done around characteristics. So we would ask any potential recipient if they wanted characteristics that match themselves. Of course, it is quite difficult because there's 2 people. It's not the same as when you're just matching a sperm donor or an egg donor. There are 2 people involved. So people, in my experience, people that have used donor embryos are really just very grateful that somebody is willing to do that. But obviously they might want certain characteristics from the donors. That is how we would do that, and we would let those recipients read your personal description, all anonymized, before they decided if they wanted to go ahead with any treatment. the law says we're not actually allowed to pay somebody to donate, whether that's eggs, sperm or embryos. We are allowed to reimburse you per appointment just to cover your expenses. The maximum allowed to reimburse is £35 a visit. So it'd be a visit, or at the moment it's more an appointment, because a lot of the appointments are over Zoom or the phone because of COVID. But you can be reimbursed £35 per appointment per partner. The likelihood is you'd need 3 appointments: counselling, screening, and a consent appointment. So that would be 6 appointments altogether with the 2 partners. But they would be joint appointments, but we can reimburse each partner. You can know if your donation is successful. So I would ask you if you wanted to know the outcome of the donation. So in practice, what we can do is let you know if there's a positive pregnancy test following the donation. And at a later date, if you wanted to know more information, we can tell you the year a baby's born, whether it's a boy or girl, and if, for example, if it was a singleton or happened to be twins. That's the information that you can know further down the line if you choose to, but that's totally up to you if you want to know that information. Next slide, please, Vic. So the legal aspects of donating. So as I've mentioned, donors are identifiable once a donor conceived child reaches the age of 18. And I've also mentioned the 10 family limit. However, it is possible that if somebody receives 2 embryos, they both could result in a child. So it is possible that, you know, the family you donate to could have 2 children. As I said, it would be very unlikely for an embryo donor ever to reach that 10 family limit. But this is heavily regulated anyway, and we sort of keep an eye on families that are created. So you can put reasonable limitations on your donation, which we discussed with you, and it's one of the things that would be covered in your counselling. One of the things that you may want to put a limitation on is in regards to legal parenthood. So particularly the legal parenthood around a single woman. So the law, if you were a single woman, donated to a single woman, the law says that lady who carries the baby is automatically seen as the legal mother. However, the law isn't as explicit in the case of who is seen as the father. So there is a legal risk that whoever donates, whoever provided the sperm could be seen as the legal father. It's very strange, and it's very frustrating, but that is a problem with single women using donor embryos in treatment. So the HEFA make it very clear that anybody, a single woman or anybody looking to donate to a single woman, ask for legal advice before they do that. This is obviously a problem for couples because they want to do something really lovely and donate their embryos, and then they're thinking, well, why have I then got to go off and get legal advice? So there is a way around that, and this is what I've found has happened in the past. So a couple can put a restriction on saying that they only want to donate to somebody in a legally recognised relationship, and then that problem goes away. And that is, in the past, that is what I've found has happened. If the embryos were created with a sperm donor, that takes that problem away because there was already a donor involved. But if it's a couple just donating their embryos, this is something that we do talk to you about, and make it clear what your options are with that. Okay, thanks, Vic. Next slide.
This is Ruth now.
So I'm going to hand over to Ruth now.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you very much. I want to say a little bit about the kind of things that me or somebody like me might discuss with you in your implications counselling appointment, and also just give you a general overview of what kind of implications you need to think about, particularly with the option of donating embryo for someone else's treatment, because the longer term consequences of the other avenues that are open to you for embryo donation are not as complex. But I will just pick up on a couple of things that both Julie and Vic have said. So Vic was talking about donating for research, and one of the things you mentioned, Vic, was about stem cells. And what's very exciting, I should declare my hand because I do sit on one of the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority committees that licenses embryo research, and it's absolutely fascinating to see the wonderful developments that are being made. And one of the things that I've learned about, which you probably esteemed people that I'm talking to know, is that an embryo obviously differentiates into every single cell in a body. So what's in that blastocyst that Vic showed you has the potential to make any sort of cell. And so there are throughout the country stem cell banks where embryos are stored, or stem cells are stored, which could make tissue in the future to treat all sorts of diseases, and that could be for posterity. Am I right, Vic, that stem cells can grow and grow, and for posterity, be kept for posterity for the treatment of others? So there are some really exciting things happening. But I think that, as Vic made very clear, is that the embryo has been given special status in law, and so scientists are not allowed to do any old research, and there's a really rigorous approval process for any research that takes place on embryos, and as Vic said, most of it is to improve outcomes for people undergoing fertility treatment, and to understand a bit more about things like implantation failure, how the cells differentiate into the placenta and into the baby, and what they can learn at a molecular level about how it all works to improve outcomes. So, so although donation to research is a finite thing, I think that if you do get involved in a project to do with stem cells, then that could be something that goes on for a long time. So back to donating embryos in the treatment of others. And one of the advantages of having the implications counselling session is that it's about you. So although I'm going to say some general things tonight, I hope that you'll all be thinking about yourselves and what your own personal attitudes are to this kind of thing, because what I'm talking about here is what might the implications be of doing this for you, for your existing children, any children yet to be born. So this is thinking about the implications for a child that may be born as a result of your donation, and for anyone else who might be affected by the donation. So the kind of things that I'm thinking about here would be very personal to your own situation, to who's in your family. You may be part of a family where the children have different mothers, different fathers, or none, or both. What are your children like? Are they very curious? How are you bringing them up? Would they or you view, for example, the existence of a genetic sibling? Because that's potentially what could be created here, is a full genetic sibling. So would you, or could you imagine your children or your family being able to view the existence of a genetic sibling with fear or with excitement? And these are the kind of questions to ask yourself: is, does that sound exciting, or is that something that fills you with dread? How switched on are you about blended families? How much do blood connections matter to you? So we joke about the nature-nurture argument, but what do you believe? Do you believe that we are all mainly the product of our environment, or do you believe we're the product of our genes? Do you think it's a bit of both? Because your personal attitudes to all of these things will inform whether this is something that you might want to consider. And this is something that I would discuss with you both on a kind of one-to-one level in counselling. When I say about anyone else affected by the donation, well, what's very interesting about this is that it's not just your genetic information, it's your parents' genetic information, it's your siblings' genetic information that potentially could result in a child being brought up in a different family. Would you feel comfortable talking to your family about this? Is this something that you think that you would want to involve other members of your family in this particular decision? Do you feel that it is your decision and yours alone, nothing to do with anybody else? So these are the kind of things that I would be helping you to consider. Julie mentioned about the potential for future contact. So the law, as Julie has said, is that your donation as of today, if you like, is anonymous. So your recipient won't know anything about you except the non-identifying information, your story, if you like, about yourselves and why you decided to donate embryos, but they won't have any identifying information about you. And the only person who is allowed to find out your identity is the actual person that is born as a result of your donation. So in the future, the parent recipients do not have a legal right to find out your identity. It is only if the individual who was created from your embryo donation is curious about you and would like to find out. And the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority manage this really well. Your information is held on a register. So this is held by a public body for posterity. And it's to that register that a person born as a result of embryo donation would be entitled to apply once they're over the age of 18. And I talk to many people about this, to sperm donors, egg donors, recipients of donor sperm and donor eggs, and you know, we have lots of conversations about whether 18-year-olds are going to be that bothered. Is it going to be 18-year-olds? Is it likely to be 35-year-olds? Is it likely to be people who are thinking about having their own family? And the thing is that at the moment we don't really know. You may be aware that the law about donation changed in 2005, and before 2005, all donations, egg, embryo, sperm donations, were entirely anonymous, and any resulting children from those donations could never find out the identity of their donors. And so if you do the maths, which is probably better than me, it isn't going to be until 2023, which is the first children conceived post 2005 who will be eligible to apply for identifying information about their donors. So at the moment, it's a bit of watch this space, because we don't exactly know at what age people will be curious, whether you know, it'll be like a floodgate opening and lots of people will want to know, or whether it might be a trickle. But the great thing is that if you do decide to donate your embryos, there'll be 18 years of other people's mistakes for you to learn from, which can happen in this enduring time, because it's a bit of an unknown at the moment. Just to say on that, we know some things though, because donors who donated before 2005, if they wished, could re-register to be an identifiable donor. And so there have been some matches made with people who've applied to the register, the HFEA register. So it's a very well managed process, complete with support systems and support workers who are there to facilitate any contact that that is wanted from the offspring of the embryo donation and the people that donated the embryos. So this is what's been set up in the act, the legal act, but of course that's in a way been sort of not overtaken or overridden, but you will probably be aware that now there is a really dramatic rise in people who are applying for direct-to-consumer DNA testing. And what this enables people to do potentially before they're 18 is to make matches, and they can make matches based on siblings, so it wouldn't necessarily have to be that particular the embryo donated child, that's the right terminology, but the child born from the embryo donation who made the application, and it could be somebody who's related to you, but this is a way in which people are making contact. And there was a recent program on television with Stacey Dooley, which was very interesting, actually, if you wanted to look at that, about a donor-conceived person who was very interested in using this direct-to-consumer DNA testing to find out a bit more about her background. So that is something that could happen in the future. And also some people are increasingly using social media to try and find out about their roots. I should say that a lot of this is happening because this legal right for 18-year-olds to find the identity isn't available to current donor-conceived adults. and so they are more likely to look for these other methods of making contact. And there is a distinct possibility that there'll be no contact at all. And as the donator of an embryo, is that you don't have the right to actually go and find the embryo donated, the child born from embryo donation. It is only a one-way traffic for that particular person to be able to get in touch with you if they wish to. So I hope that makes sense. But of course, anybody can do the direct-to-consumer DNA testing. So all of this that I've just been talking about is about, if you like, the potential for a full genetic sibling of your child or your children to be born into a different family. And this is going to mean different things for different people, again, depending on what your personal attitudes are. So when you look about your personal considerations and what's important to you, and I also provide counselling for a surrogacy agency, and I'm often charged with sort of talking to the surrogates when they're first thinking about becoming a surrogate, and I'm like, why would you do that? Why would you, deliberately get pregnant and carry somebody else's child for 9 months and all the hardship? And for those of you who've been pregnant, it's a long journey. It's fraught with risks, and only to hand the baby over. And this is something that you can kind of search in your own hearts about whether that, not particularly becoming a surrogate, but whether that kind of person is you. So are you the sort of person, which is the same as some of our sperm donors or egg donors, who will donate anything? They'll donate blood, they'll donate plasma, eggs, whatever you want, because they see an opportunity to make a real difference to the world, and that they're not particularly attached to their tissue, if you like, their biology, their genetic connections. Would you, if you'd had the opportunity, because I guess that most of you who've created embryos have created them because you've needed assisted conception, but would you have donated sperm or eggs if you'd had the opportunity? Is that something that you might have considered if you were able to? Are you the sort of person that really does want to change the world and make a big difference, a big splash? Or do you just want to change a small corner of the world? Or are you satisfied and fulfilled with a quieter family life? And these are very personal decisions that will inform whether this is for you. Vic said a little bit, and Julie as well, about the potential recipients. And I know that some of you, sadly, will have known the heartache of not being able to conceive a child naturally. And this is where I spend all my days, really, is as do Julie and Vic, is talking to and supporting people who are really struggling to get pregnant. And there are certain patients, not just at Complete Fertility, but certain patients, certain people who have exhausted all other avenues. And these are people who potentially may have had numerous IVF cycles, starting off with their own sperm and their own eggs potentially. But because over time it hasn't worked, they've got older and older, and their eggs and sperm, for whatever reason, are no longer doing the job, and this may be their only option. Also, I've met people, as I'm sure Julie and Vic have as well, who've had premature ovarian failure. So women who basically had an early menopause, quite young. And sometimes they may be in same-sex relationships, so they're needing to have donor sperm anyway. And this is a lovely option sometimes for same-sex women who are unable to use their own eggs, and they use the term to actually adopt an embryo, because it's not, in a way, it's not having a donor conceived child, because these embryos weren't conceived, weren't made, if you like, to be donated. But a lot of same-sex couples and single women, I say this about single women as well, like the concept of adopting an embryo. And that's something that they would rather, if there is an embryo there, rather than creating another one, they would love to have the opportunity to use it. I don't need to tell most of you probably about the heartache. I'm sure that a lot of you have been through it already, and I don't want to pull at your heartstrings. It's a very personal decision, but I think that the bottom line here is that these are people who really, 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 really want children. So they're likely, the children are likely, you never know, but they're likely to grow up in a very loving family because of the efforts that have been made to actually have them in the first place. And I wouldn't, despite what Julie says, and she's absolutely right to raise red flags about the legal situation, that it's a shame, if you like, to discount single women completely. The legal situation is very complex, because it would be for a court to decide if there was some dispute about legal parenthood, about whether you as the man who's donated the embryo could be seen as the legal father. And that would take somebody, it may be you, so it may be you who wanted to be involved in the child, who wanted to take that to court, or it could be the single woman who's decided that she wants you in her life, although she's never met you. So you can see how kind of unusual these situations would be. But at the same time, you've got to make sure that you're protected if you do, if you are a male partner who is donating, part of a couple donating an embryo. So risk-benefit analysis, it's a funny thing, you know, all these terms that I use as a counsellor, but it's something I use very often, again, with surrogates or with people who are considering egg and sperm donation. And this is the question to ask yourself, really, is that, you know, what are the potential psychological risks to you of doing this? Because that's what they are, aren't they? Is well, how might it be for you to have somebody contact you in 18 years' time who is a full genetic sibling to your child? This is that a risk that you're prepared to take? Can you see that as something exciting that could enhance your life? Or is that something that you'd find really difficult and be quite fearful about? Because it's about, you know, what makes somebody donate gametes or become a surrogate. And this comes down to your attitudes towards honesty as well, because it's a conversation you would have to have with your children potentially. Well, I say you have to have, you don't legally have to, no one's going to force you to have this conversation with your own children about you donating embryos, but it's something that we would encourage you to do so that your own children are prepared for the fact that they may have a full genetic sibling in the world. And as Julie said, that you can find out whether the treatment was successful so that you'll know whether there is even any conversation to be had, because unfortunately it may not be successful, and so it may be a moot point and there'll be nothing to discuss potentially. So this last thing, that WIIFM, is what's in it for me. So why would you even bother to consider this? And I think that that really what I want to say about this, as someone who's sort of worked with fertility patients for nearly 20 years, and I know that Julie and Vic have amassed a huge number of years between them, is that there is no greater gift. So of all the altruistic things that you could do, this probably trumps them all. You're enabling, I get quite emotional actually, because I've you know, talked to lots of people who've been on the receiving end of this, but you know, you are enabling a new life that will bring joy to parents, to their siblings, cousins, aunts, mothers, fathers, and a person that you will have been enabled to be created who will hopefully go on to have children of their own. It's literally a decision that you make that could change the world. And you will remember how many people were absolutely rooting for you to get pregnant and for you to have your family, and how happy they were when you announced your pregnancy. Well, this is an opportunity for you to bottle that and give it to someone else. So when you're doing your risk-benefit analysis, it's about being able to know for the rest of your life that you've done this wonderful thing, despite some of the risks that there could be to you in the future. So you would get the opportunity anyway to explore this with me or with another counsellor. So it's not that, you know, you make a decision and that's it. And as Vic said, until your donation is used in the treatment of someone else or for research, you can withdraw your consent or change your consent at any time. So just to summarise, that these are your 5 options when you're considering what to do with your embryos. So donate to research, enable the brilliant embryologists to become even better at what they do by donating for training, humane discard, so the thawing out of your embryos with the possibility of you being able to take the straws home if you would like to do that. You can delay the decision and continue storage, and continue to pay the storage fees until the 10-year storage limit for most people, or you could consider donating your embryos for the treatment of others. So that's all that I wanted to say. I don't know whether Vic and Julie want to add anything, and whether any of you have got any questions that you would like to put to us via the Q&A. I think Vic's already answered one, but Vic and Julie, is there anything else that you would like to say?
Just that you made me cry, Ruth. Yeah.
Yes.
Its donation is an incredible thing when you, yeah, it's lovely to hear you speaking about it like that.
I see from both sides, so I deal with the donors and the recipients, and all I can say is it is a really, really lovely thing to do, and the recipients are always so grateful that somebody is willing to do such a lovely thing for them. But it, you know, obviously it has to be right for you, and you know, you have to be sure that's what you want to do. But if you do, it is a really lovely, lovely, kind thing to consider.
I'm just going to read the questions that we've had, if that's all right, Ruth, because we've had a few actually.
Yes.
For the benefit of people who are viewing this webinar later.
Yes.
So we had a question about storage fees. So at what point do we receive the invoice for storage fees? Is that when they finished being stored, or do we receive invoices every year? So the answer to that was you should receive an annual storage fee. You should pay an annual storage fee and receive an annual invoice from us if your storage is not covered by the NHS, and you should receive that every year. So it's not something that we would bill you the whole package kind of at the end of the time that your embryo is in storage. And just to say that if you are expecting an invoice or an annual letter from us and you haven't received it, then please do let us know. The next question was how, if we're thinking about donating to research, how would we do that? And the best way to do that is to contact us. So contact us directly. We've got a consent form for you to state your wishes. You can do that by just giving us a call on the general clinic number, and the lab is the best people to speak to. We're on option 3. Of that, the number is 02380 010 570, option 3, or you can email info@completefertility.co.uk, or for those of you who are attending this webinar live, my email address is in the Q&A as well, and we can talk you through the options and what to do with the form and that kind of thing. The next question was, if we do decide to donate blastocysts for research, at what stage of development do the embryos progress to during the course of the research, which is a really, really good question. And I said, of course, that depends very much on the research project. So some embryos may be thawed out and used pretty much straight away for whatever research is happening. Some embryos may be grown for a little bit longer than that in the lab. But Ruth is a pro on this, so she's working with the HFEA, but the current law, as I believe, states that embryos can't be cultured or grown in the lab beyond 14 days of development. That's right, Ruth?
Yep.
At the moment, yep. And it's set at that point right now because 14 days is when the embryo starts to develop the very first beginnings of a nervous system. So the primitive streak is a line down the embryo, different cells developing that would eventually lead on to the nervous system. So that's why the line was drawn at that point. But not all projects will involve keeping embryos that long in the lab. Yeah, those were all the questions that we've received so far. So if anyone has anything else that they want to ask, we'll wait for a few more minutes to see if you want to pop that into the Q&A. And I'll also just apologise if there's anyone here tonight who tried to attend the webinar yesterday and couldn't get in. I'm really sorry for that. There will be another kind of more general webinar in the next few weeks, so keep an eye on the website for that if you missed out last night. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Vic. That's really really useful, and thank you for your questions. So so I said at the beginning that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube and on our website, on the Complete Fertility website. So if you know of anybody else who is in this similar situation of wondering what to do, then please direct them this way. And of course, you can watch it again if you need to. But I think that what I want to reiterate about this is that that we recognise that this is a very difficult decision for people to decide what to do with their embryos, and that we want to give you time, space, and the opportunity to discuss it. And that when you're ready, please do get in touch with the clinic, and we can arrange for counselling sessions, and for you to, if you're interested in donating for treatment, for you to speak to Julie, or for research or training, or extending your consent, then Vic is obviously the person to speak to, or to arrange a counselling session to discuss your own situation. We just want to make sure that the decision that you make is the right one for you, which I think is the most important thing. Are there any more questions?
I've just noticed, oh sorry, do you want to answer it, Vic?
So you can answer it. I've just said you were the expert, Julie.
Okay, lovely. So I've just noticed the question regarding if you want to donate embryos that were created with donor sperm around the family limit. So the person who's asked it's a very good question, and you are quite right. To be able to do that, we would have to first check that the sperm donor hasn't reached his 10 family limit. So if somebody wants to donate embryos, that's the first thing we would do. We would go back to our records of the sperm donor. And if the sperm donor still has a family slot available, we would be able to donate the embryos, but we would need to, you're quite right, we would need to check that first before we could go any further.
Do you want to say what option you are on the number, on the phone number, because I can't remember?
So I actually have my own, I have a direct line. It is option 4 on the main number, but the donor team has a direct line, which is 02380 010 575. Or if you come through to the main number, or option 4. So if you've got any questions at all, don't hesitate to give me a call, or we have a donor coordinator email, which is donorcoordinator@completefertility.co.uk. So if you've got any questions, please either drop me an email or give me a call, and I'd be quite happy to chat you through.
Thank you. It just remains for me just to close this session now. Thank you very much for those of you who've attended, and to those of you who may be listening to this later. And I hope you found it helpful, and thanks to Julie and Vic, my colleagues too. And good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.